The idea of the intentional fallacy is that it is wrong to think that the only significant meaning that you can derive from a movie is that which the director specifically intended. My friend and I recorded a podcast episode in August of 2020 about the intentional fallacy and how it may relate to film. That was the line I used to introduce the topic. Since then, I've realized that this definition is not the whole picture, nor is it wholly reflective of why it's a significant idea to me. The intentional fallacy itself is one result of a concept called authorial intent, which more generally refers to simply the author's intent as it is likely figuratively coded into their work. Authorial, or actual intentionalism, as it is in Huddleston's article from 2012, is the idea that the author's intent should constrain the way the work is properly interpreted. While this concept is largely used to inform criticism for written works, the same concept can effectively be extrapolated to film and TV, and I'll note now that I'll be referring exclusively to film for this video. For me, the purpose of me making this the topic of the original podcast episode was twofold. To explain why I feel it is okay to put focus into the creator's intent with a film, and to articulate how I feel it may play a part in evaluating the quality of a film, whatever that means. So why bring this up now? Well, I was pleasantly surprised to see an editorial by Sonny Bunch in the Washington Post about this topic in relation to Adam McKay's Don't Look Up and Lana Wachowski's Matrix Resurrections, both released in late 2021. I'll link this article down below if anybody'd like to read further. In retrospect, I feel like I didn't really explain effectively why I personally value the creator's intent in a work. In the second podcast episode we did, I made a brief statement about it where I said that I value the creator's intent because I feel like that information, along with the viewing experience, can allow you to glean some insight into who the creator is. In my mind, it wasn't necessarily what elements they decided to include in the film, but rather how they included them. Ultimately, I'm no longer sure if I really put as much value on this now as I did then. Aside from a risk of confirmation bias, a fictional film may very possibly have too many individual elements to create a consistent picture like the one I claimed that it could back then, even if the director's personal style is intentionally very apparent throughout the work. So, with all that being said, let's revisit some of the movies we discussed a year and a half ago. And I mean, of course we're going to start with Deer Hunter, because why not? I think at this point Michael Cimino has just infected my brain with his presence and caused me to think that his movies are somehow always relevant to any discussion, but I digress. Released in 1978, Deer Hunter was Cimino's directorial debut, which centered around the Vietnam War and its effects on those involved. The movie used Russian roulette as a narrative device to support the themes involved throughout. If one looks deeper into the background of production, as well as reaction from the film's release, they'll find numerous instances of debate on intention and controversy related to elements in the film. The most obvious place to start with this film is with arguably the most prominent narrative element, Russian roulette. In the movie, De Niro, Walken, and Savage are captured and forced to play Russian roulette while in Vietnam. Ultimately, while De Niro and Savage seem relatively unaffected, Walken seems to be suddenly consumed by it, or at least motivated enough to continue to play Russian roulette perpetually, deciding to stay in Vietnam. One argument surrounding the inclusion of it is that it's simply a misrepresentation of the war, since there are no reports of Russian roulette ever being played. This, on top of the fact that many view the movie as detrimentally one-sided in its portrayal of the war, in a figurative or literal sense, can create one particular impression of the film, intended or not. Another way to look at it is that the film is shot in a certain way, and Russian roulette is included in a certain way, such that it's simply a metaphor for something the main characters are experiencing, thus it's not meant to be interpreted literally. Obviously, though this is more in line with what Cimino apparently intended, it's also very possible for one to come to this conclusion on their own, irrespective of having any background knowledge surrounding the intention of the production. Another interesting element to look at is Meryl Streep's character Linda. The actual construction and elements of her character aside, what is noteworthy is how her character developed during the production. Reportedly, when Streep was given her character, the role was much less developed than the final product would lead one to believe. Cimino suggested she write her own lines for the part, and the end result is a character that, arguably, brings a substantial emotional component to the film in the end. This is the most interesting idea about Deer Hunter when considering the intentional fallacy. Certainly, the intent behind the film can be viewed differently if one has the context of her character's development. Perhaps the original intent behind the film was different with her role being as small as it reportedly was. But it begs the question, do either of these points really inform one's opinion of the film and interpretation of the film enough to change it significantly for them? The other movie I want to discuss is Alan Parker's Mississippi Burning, released in 1988. The movie is based on the murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Mississippi, 1964, and focuses on two FBI investigators trying to uncover information surrounding their disappearances. And now, as a film based to some degree on true events, inherently you can anticipate some of the kinds of criticism and commentary that could be leveraged against it. Couple that with the fact that it was based on events related to the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the US, and the movie ended up generating significant controversy upon release. Like with Deer Hunter, I'm not necessarily concerned with explaining details within the film, as I feel these are ultimately tangential to the idea of creator intention versus audience interpretation. A primary sentiment following the film's release is that it was in potentially poor taste and even disrespectful to focus on a group of white characters as opposed to, even somewhat, emphasizing the civil rights struggle from a black perspective. A critic from Time magazine on release described it as just another Mississippi whitewash and a cinematic lynching of the truth. The Washington Post, in a relatively more neutral review, criticized it for being from an all-white perspective and that it had the right story but the wrong heroes.
My guest today is one of Britain's most experienced and successful film directors, Sir Alan Parker.
Alan Parker was understandably in defense of his film. In an interview on BBC Hard Talk in 2013, when asked why he didn't elect to focus more on the black perspective of the civil rights movement as opposed to the main white characters, Parker had this to say.
We're leading the civil rights movement. And that Martin Luther King, for example.
It wasn't me, you don't understand, is that there's an entire film industry out there. There are people who give you money to make films, and those film studios, which are American film studios, at the time, if the two heroes of that story had been black and not white, the film would not have been made at that moment in time. And
maybe it shouldn't have been made then.
No, it's a very powerful film that would have allowed lots of other films to be made on the same subject.
He goes on further to make a distinction between the fact that he made a movie that was only 2 hours up there. I can't tell the entire story of the American civil rights story. It wasn't a misrepresentation of the truth, and it was a movie. It wasn't a documentary. It wasn't what you do, referring to the interviewer's profession as a journalist. Whether or not these contextual elements of filmmaking that Parker speaks about are true, they are certainly what he appears to believe, and I think it would be naive to ignore the degree to which they could motivate his creative decisions as a director. In the mid-20th century, a literary movement called New Criticism gained significant traction. This movement, influenced in part by work from I.A. Richards and T.S. Eliot, among others, focused on trying to evaluate literary works on the basis of their content alone, believing that they should be viewed as, effectively, self-contained works. A primary counter-argument to this movement was that it is nearly impossible to ignore that literary works are framed by historical context and that they have some sort of social effect. If we consider this framework in terms of film, the same principles can apply. Looking back at Parker's responses, it's apparent that he believes films serve a certain function, or maybe that they specifically don't serve others. In defending Mississippi Burning, he says that it was a 2-hour film, not a documentary. I believe this is meant to suggest that he believes creative license can be taken for the purpose of telling a story, perhaps much more so than if a film is explicitly a documentary. His belief in this regard, if true, could certainly inform the production of his film. Let's look at Deer Hunter again. On release, there was the aforementioned sentiment that it was detrimentally one-sided. Producer Barry Spikings noted that we didn't intend the film to be exploitative in any way, but said he regrets the way the Vietnamese were portrayed, saying that he feels like we, as in those involved in the production, were ignorant. As is certainly apparent, the public opinion concerning this element persisted, even if it was clear that the intention was not for the film to be as one-sided as it perhaps ultimately ended up being. Historical context from a broad perspective can be seen over decades of filmmaking, and indeed with Deer Hunter. I'm sure any of you could quite quickly think of some films that suffered a neutral or negative response on release, but have subsequently been reevaluated more positively as years have gone on. In spite of the initial strong reactions a film may generate, history has shown that there is every chance that those opinions will level out. This is not a one-sided relationship either, as films can certainly be regarded progressively less highly as time goes on as well, though, curiously, it seems like this occurs less often in comparison. Once again, though, this begs the question, does additional context like this affect your interpretation or opinion of a film in any meaningful way? I mentioned at the beginning of the video that the second reason why authorial intent is significant to me is that it may play a role in evaluating the quality of a film. By quality, I suppose I simply mean what grade, based on some predetermined scale, I would give a film. I'm only going to speak briefly on this, as it is heavily, if not entirely, subjective in all aspects. I think for me personally, I do value how well a film does at articulating its themes and topics throughout. One major shortcoming of this, however, is that it isn't always sufficiently clear what these elements are, nor are they even consistently explicitly stated by the creators. Beyond this, placing value on authorial intent could potentially have negative implications. While ultimately, studios are businesses that need to make sustainable profits, a portion of individual creators may certainly value high critical response to their works. If it was ever clearly established that the effectiveness of the personification of themes and messages in their films was weighted as heavily as I have at different occasions felt that it should, this may end up incentivizing this element over others, and thus could result in a decreased amount of variety of subject matter in films as certain elements become more critically favored. Granted, this is simply speculation, and again, only one aspect of filmmaking and film viewing. Yeah, that was a mouthful. Let me explain. Okay, I love science fiction, and I really love science fiction that focuses on human emotion and its relationship with technology. Sounds familiar, right? Now, let's say I love those two things, but especially when they're conveyed using a bunch of long takes and wide-angle shooting. Sounds like the sequel. Even though I love these movies, I can only imagine that I would be so thoroughly jaded by them if movies like them suddenly constituted 80% of new sci-fi films, or even 50% or 10%. I believe that this is something that could very easily happen if it was suddenly clear that awards panels were vetting their decisions with the favoritism of these elements in mind, regardless of how easy or difficult it may be to create a movie with these elements versus others. So, even though people do share the sentiment that awards ceremonies are favoring certain elements anyways, I think the fact that it remains not officially clear is still very much a positive. I suppose the reason I was previously so willing to die on this hill is that I took issue with people using fictional works as means of support of their own arguments. To me, this is inherently weak support for an argument, since the significance or meaning of a film would always be interpreted differently from person to person. So in my mind, the only way to rationalize this tendency would be to use the creator's direct, specific intent of their work as means to support that argument. What has since become apparent for me is that everybody has their own narrative and opinions about anything and everything, which are, to a degree, founded on their personal convictions and beliefs, and ultimately, those elements will not change unless they decide so. So, with that being said, what does it all mean? Does authorial intent matter in artistic creation? Who the hell knows? And perhaps that's how it should be. What I do know, however, is that if you're like me, you find intrinsic enjoyment out of knowing additional context surrounding a film's creation. I enjoy it because it makes the experience more interactive for me. I played the viola for 6 years when I was younger, and I personally have loved so far how it influences listening to music for me daily. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this concept. Do you enjoy making movie or show viewing a fairly interactive activity, or do you prefer to use it to relax, or somewhere in between? And how do you feel about authorial intent? Does it inform your impression of films or shows? Thanks for watching.